Hi, everybody. I'm sharing my screen right now, so you should be seeing an ad for a study. There's a student in the department that is looking to collect participants for a study that they're doing. This is that study, so if you are interested in doing some extra credit, you can get up to 3 credits in SONA. Remember that for the purposes of this class, I double whatever SONA gives you up to a maximum of 8 points. So if you want to get 3 credits, I'll double that to 6 extra credit points in this class. So if you're looking for extra credit, feel free to sign up for the study called Virtual Problem Solving. Okay, you don't have to do that, obviously. You can get your extra credit by doing other studies or extra credit papers, but here's an opportunity if you're interested. Okay, let me just stop sharing for a second. A few more announcements. I've mentioned this the last couple classes. I just want to mention it one more time. Remember that the exam that was scheduled for Tuesday of next week is actually being rescheduled. It's actually now Thursday of next week. So I'm going to finish up talking about cognitive dissonance today. I'm going to record a lecture tomorrow on conformity. I will post that lecture to YouTube. I'll put a link to it in Canvas. So make sure that you watch that lecture at some point prior to the exam on Thursday, because you're going to be responsible for it on the exam. In fact, just to make sure everyone's on the same page with what you're responsible for on the exam, let me just share my screen and go to the syllabus again. We didn't quite get finished this last topic before the first exam. We talked about the self, and we had talked about the affective component and the cognitive component of the self. But the behavioral component of the self, we talked about after exam 1, so you are responsible for that for exam 2. That's where we talked about things like self-presentation strategies and self-monitoring. You're also responsible for social cognition when we talked about all the biases and heuristics that people have. You're responsible for attributions, for attitudes, and for cognitive dissonance theory, which will end today, or we'll end that section in today's lecture. And then conformity, which, as I said, I'll pre-record tomorrow. So make sure that you are up to date with that material. That's what you're responsible for exam 2. Also, one more reminder that the first assignment has been posted on Canvas as of last Tuesday, and that means that it is due tomorrow at 5 o'clock. That's going to be 5 o'clock sharp. So Canvas is set up to only accept your assignments up until 5 p.m. sharp. If you're 1 minute late, it won't accept it. So make sure that you get that assignment turned in on time. Okay. Also, I realized that I haven't posted a study guide yet for exam 2. I will do that as soon as I can. I'll probably get that up there tomorrow, so I'll post that in the study guide section on Canvas as well. Okay, so let's continue talking about cognitive dissonance theory. So let me just remind you about the basic idea behind cognitive dissonance theory. So this is the idea that we'd like all of our thoughts and our beliefs and our behaviors to be consistent with one another. And when they're not consistent, that can often produce this negative, this aversive arousal, which we call cognitive dissonance. So in other words, if we behave in a way that doesn't match our attitudes. So for instance, if we have a negative attitude towards cheating, and yet we cheat on a test, our behavior conflicts with our attitudes. And under those conditions, that will often produce cognitive dissonance. That'll produce this aversive arousal experience that we're motivated to try to reduce. And so cognitive dissonance theory is all about the various ways that we have of trying to eliminate or at least reduce that cognitive dissonance that's created when we behave in a way that conflicts with our attitudes. Okay, that's how I've explained it so far in terms of behaviors conflicting with attitudes. For today's lecture, I want to talk about 2 other domains in which we tend to see cognitive dissonance as well. It's still based on the same idea that we don't want to behave in ways that conflict with our attitudes. But there's a bit of a slightly different flavor to each of these. And so at the end of last class, I had introduced this idea here. I wanted you to imagine that you're a member of a group that thinks the world was going to end on October 21st, 2011, and there was a group that believes that the world was going to end. And here's some billboards and a bus that show that. So imagine you're part of this organization, and to join this organization, you sell all of your possessions and cut off all of your family members and friends to prepare for those final days. Well, obviously, we know that October 21st came and went, 2011 came and went, and we're still here, right? So according to this group, the end of the world is going to begin on May 21st, 2011, and the absolute end of the world is going to happen October 21st, 2011. Obviously, that didn't happen, right? So for the people that believed in this end of the world prophecy, like these women here who are strangely happy, given that they think the world is going to end very shortly. But for these people, how did they deal with being proven to be wrong when the world didn't end? I mean, after all, they've expended a lot of effort in order to join this group for these beliefs, right? They've had to cut off their family members. They've had to sell their possessions and basically quit their jobs or quit school, right? So how did they cope when they realized the world wasn't going to end? I mean, after all, if they underwent all that effort and they were to simply accept that they were wrong in their beliefs, well, then why did they undergo all that effort? Why did they sacrifice so much for beliefs that turned out to be wrong? Well, the leader of this organization that believed this, his name was Harold Camping. After his prophecy turned out to be false, here's what Harold Camping said. This is from an interview with him. So here's what Harold Camping said. I can tell you very candidly that when May 21st came and went, it was a very difficult time. I was wondering what is going on. In my mind, I went back through all the promises God has made, all of the proofs, all of the signs, and everything was fitting perfectly. So what in the world happened? I really was praying and praying, oh Lord, what happened? Then what the journalist said is this. What he decided apparently was that May 21st had been an invisible judgment day of the spiritual variety. In other words, when faced with this disconfirming evidence that should have called into question the foundation of his beliefs, instead of accepting that he was wrong, he instead had to rationalize it or justify it somehow. And he was able to justify it by convincing himself that although it wasn't the physical end of the world, it was the spiritual end of the world. There was an invisible judgment day. Right? That way, he could still maintain a belief that he was correct all along, even in the face of disconfirming evidence. Because again, if he had to accept that he was wrong, then he would face massive amounts of cognitive dissonance, because his attitude would be, well, I'm a competent decision maker, but his behavior would be, well, I gave up everything in order to believe in this thing that turned out to be false. That would create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. So to avoid that dissonance, he convinced himself, he justified his behavior by convincing himself that in fact he was right, just in a different way, right? That it was an invisible judgment day. What we're talking about here is an example of another domain in which we tend to see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects. Specifically, the second domain we're looking at. So the first domain was justifying attitude discrepant behavior, what we talked about all last class. The second domain is looking at when people have to justify having suffered for something, having given up something in order to join a group, let's say. So the people in this organization, they had to cut off family and friends and sell their possessions and quit their jobs. They suffered, in other words, for their beliefs. And when that happens, when we suffer for our beliefs or when we suffer to join a group, we have to justify all of that past suffering. If we suffer for something to join a group, let's say that we are joining a fraternity or a sorority or something, and we've been initiated, and you suffer for a few days in order to be initiated into this group. And we get into the group and it turns out, you know, we don't really want to be in this group in the first place. Well, then why did we undergo all that suffering, right? That calls into question our abilities to think that we're a good decision maker, right? So we've got to justify having undergone all of that effort to get rid of the cognitive dissonance that would be created otherwise. In fact, we already seen an example of this in this class, because in the first couple weeks of class, when we were talking about research methods, I gave an example of a study to walk you through various research method decisions that researchers might make. And that study that I walked you through was based on cognitive dissonance theory. So just to refresh your memories as to what the study was about, this is a study done in the 60s where a bunch of women signed up for a study and they were told they were going to be having a sex discussion. And when they showed up for this study, they were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. So a third of the women were immediately allowed to join this discussion. A third of the women underwent a mild initiation in which they had to read off a list of mildly sexually suggestive words. And a third group of women in order to join this discussion, had to undergo a severe initiation in which they had to read off a list of X-rated words in front of a strange male experimenter. So for the most part, that kind of embarrasses these women in a sense. So once the woman either went through a severe initiation, a mild initiation, or no initiation, they all joined a group discussion. And if you recall, they were placed in booths and they put headphones on, and they were told because it was their first session, they were only going to be listening to this discussion and not participating. And what they were really hearing, though, was a tape recording of a discussion that people were having about the secondary sexual characteristics of invertebrates like beetles. It's a really absolutely boring and basically worthless discussion that these women were having. And so what the researchers wanted to know, though, is they were testing this idea, this prediction that was being made by cognitive dissonance theory. They were testing whether the women who underwent the severe initiation, who basically had to embarrass themselves in order to join this group, whether they would experience cognitive dissonance if they joined the group. It turns out that they didn't like it. And so to avoid that cognitive dissonance, they would justify to themselves that in fact they actually liked the group discussion. Okay, now this discussion, as I said, was one of the most worthless and uninteresting discussions imaginable. That's in the author's own words. Okay. And we see that for women who did not, who were not initiated, or women who underwent a mild initiation, which wasn't really that embarrassing, they correctly stated that the conversation was really boring. They really did not like it. But for the women who underwent the severe initiation, they really liked the discussion. Now, it's the exact same discussion in all three of these groups, right? So the only reason we have for why these group of women in the severe initiation condition liked the group discussion more is because of the independent variable, meaning it's because of the initiation itself. The severe initiation caused them to like the group more. Okay? If they embarrassed themselves in front of this experimenter and they got to this group and said, you know what, this discussion is really, really boring, that would create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance, because their attitude is, I'm a good decision maker, and their behavior is, well, I embarrassed myself to join a group that I didn't like to be in the first place. That's discrepant with my attitude that I'm a good decision maker. So to justify their behavior, they convinced themselves that in fact this discussion was actually really quite interesting. And again, a key here is that these women aren't lying. They're not just saying the discussion was fun, but in fact, they didn't really like it. They've actually come to convince themselves that they really liked that group discussion. Okay? And they're justifying their past effort. I kind of alluded to this a minute ago. But there are some data showing that people who undergo an initiation in order to join a group in a sort of real world scenario, not just in this artificial lab scenario, but in real world scenarios, that if people undergo initiations, they end up liking the group more. And at some level, that kind of seems counterintuitive if you don't have a social psychological understanding, because if, for instance, let's say you're being initiated, you're being hazed before you can join a fraternity or a sorority. Well, these are the people who made you suffer for days. And when you get to the group, if they made you suffer, you like the group more. That seems weird, right? Why would we like the group more if those are the very people that made us suffer? But it makes sense with a social psychological perspective, because the act of having suffered, of having willingly put yourself through that suffering, you feel a strong need to justify it after the fact, which we'll often do by convincing ourselves that all that suffering was worth it, that we really liked the group that we joined. In fact, this prediction of cognitive dissonance theory was known to Leon Festinger. Leon Festinger is the guy who came up with cognitive dissonance theory in the first place. And he realized that this was one of the predictions that his theory made. And so what he did is he found out about this cult. And this cult at the time believed that the world was going to end. Now, this is back in the 50s. They believed the world was going to end. I believe it was December 21st, 1954. And so Leon Festinger thought, well, what's going to happen when the world doesn't actually end on that day? How will these people justify their commitment to this belief? I mean, to join this group required you to quit your job, to quit school, to sell your possessions, to cut off your family, and to cut off your friends. That's what people had to do to join this group. And so if people did all of that, and they joined this cult, and then they realized that everything they suffered for, their beliefs they suffered for it, the world was going to end on December 21st, didn't come to pass, that should create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. So Leon Festinger was interested in how would these people justify having sold everything they own and cut off their families if it turns out that their beliefs were proven to be wrong. He was curious about this. So what he did is he went undercover and joined the cult to see what would happen. Okay, now I'll tell you a little bit about the cult. The cult was led by a woman by the name of Miriam Keach. Miriam Keach claimed to be in contact with an alien race. This alien race was called the Guardians. And this alien race told her, supposedly, that a giant flood was coming on December 21st, 1954. And it was going to destroy the entire Earth. However, the night before, at midnight, the night before, these aliens were going to come down and they were going to take her and her followers aboard their spaceship and take them off to this utopia. Okay? So this group of people that believed this, they were called the Seekers. And they prepared for the end of days. Right? As I said, they had to cut off their family and friends and sell their possessions and quit their job, et cetera, et cetera. And so Leon Festinger went undercover as one of these people, one of the cult members. And the night before the spaceship was supposed to come down, everyone in this group, everyone in the Seekers gathers in this one location, okay, waiting for the spaceship to show up at midnight to save them before the flood comes in the morning. And so this is the moment that Leon Festinger has been waiting for, right? How would people deal with it when it was proven that their beliefs were incorrect? So everyone's kind of nervous, and they have to memorize passwords to get on board the spaceships. They're all working on memorizing these passwords. And they're told that they're not allowed to bring any metal on board the spaceship. So the guys are realizing that their flies in their pants are made out of metal, so they're cutting out the flies of their pants. And the women realize that there's an underwire in their bra that's made of metal, so they're all trying to get rid of the underwire in their bra. And they're all really preparing, because these people truly believe this is what's going to happen. And so they all gather in a room. And it's getting closer and closer to midnight, and you could feel the tension in this room, right? And the clock strikes 12. That's when the aliens are supposed to come. And nothing happens. And they wait a little longer, and it's 12:05 in the morning, and nothing happens. And it's 12:10 and 12:15. Now it's 12:30. Now it's 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and nothing's happened. And this group is basically freaking out, right? Because one of two things is happening. Either the aliens decided not to come and they're all going to die in a flood in a matter of hours, or their beliefs were wrong, and that's going to produce massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. So these people, either way, these people are really, really concerned and kind of freaking out here. And then what happens is that at 4 in the morning, Miriam Keach, the leader of the Seekers, she leaves the group, she goes into another room. She comes out a few minutes later and she says, I just talked with the Guardians, the alien race. And what they told me is that our group, the Seekers, has spread so much light into the world that they've decided to stop the flood. We have saved the world. This is what she tells people. Now, to us, that's ridiculous, right? That's preposterous. What do you mean you saved the world? Obviously, your beliefs were wrong. That's what happened, right? But to the people in the group, they couldn't accept that. They can't accept that their beliefs are wrong, because they have to justify all the effort, everything that they've done in the past, cutting off their friends and family, right? So what do? They start celebrating and cheering and high-fiving each other. We've saved the world. They come to believe that they have saved the world, because if they can believe they've saved the world, then everything they've put into this, having cut off their friends and family and sold their possessions and quit their job and quit school, it's all worth it. It's justified their effort, right? So to justify that effort, they've convinced themselves they've saved the world. Just like in more recent days, Harold Camping justified his failed prophecy by saying that May 21st was an invisible spiritual judgment day as opposed to a physical judgment day. Leon Festinger actually wrote a book about this called When Prophecy Fails. So if you're interested in learning more about that, pick up that book. But I want to show you a couple quotes from some of the members of the Seekers. Now, these were quotes that were obtained by Festinger prior to having their beliefs disconfirmed. Okay, so prior to December 21st. This is when they still believed the spaceship was coming. So here's one. One person said the following: I have to believe the flood is coming on the 21st because I've spent all my money, I quit my job, I quit computer school, I have to believe. And if we think about this statement for a second, it seems quite illogical, right? I mean, they're not saying I have to believe because the evidence is leading me to believe this, or I have to believe because it makes logical sense. They're saying I have to believe that aliens are coming because I spent my money and I quit school and I quit my job. How does that make any sense, right? Unless you understand what's actually happening here, unless you have a social psychological understanding. What they're saying is, I've put in so much effort to this belief that I can't just abandon my beliefs now because that would create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. I have to believe because I spent my money, I quit my job, and I quit computer school. I put all that effort into believing that to avoid that cognitive dissonance, that's what's leading me to have to believe. Here's another example of another one of these cult members. I've had to go a long way. I've given up just about everything. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. I have to believe, and there isn't any other truth. Okay? Now, the notable line here is I can't afford to doubt. They're not saying I believe it, again, because there's evidence, because it makes logical sense. I can't afford to doubt because of everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed for this belief, which again doesn't seem to make logical sense unless you have a social psychological understanding of what's actually happening here. Because what they're saying is true. They can't afford to doubt because the psychological cognitive dissonance they're going to experience if they were to doubt would be so massive they wouldn't be able to handle it psychologically, right? So they have to believe because they've cut every tie and burned every bridge. Okay. You might be able to see, by the way, how cognitive dissonance effects can get tied into things like confirmation biases and belief perseverance, right? If you believe something and you believe something for years, we don't really want to abandon those beliefs because that would call into question why we believe this thing for the past 5 or 10 years. That calls into question our abilities to consider ourselves good decision makers. And so what that means is we're motivated to only look for confirming information, which is the confirmation bias, in order to avoid cognitive dissonance. We're motivated to have our beliefs persevere. So remember, with belief perseverance, even when you're faced with contradictory information, information that undermines your original belief, we often still cling on to our original beliefs. And part of the reason for that is due to cognitive dissonance. If we were to abandon our beliefs, we'd experience a lot of cognitive dissonance. So for this reason, it can be kind of hard for people to change their beliefs after a while. It's not impossible, of course. We can get around that, but it can be difficult to do so, partly for this reason. All right, so that was the second domain in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects, when we have to justify past effort. A third domain in which we see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects is when we have to justify making difficult decisions. We're often in situations where we have to do that, right? Which of these 2 job offers would I rather take? Which of these 2 schools would I rather go to? Which of these 2 houses would I rather buy? Which of these 2 people would I like to date? Et cetera, et cetera. And we may struggle with these decisions for days or weeks because they seem really close decisions, right? And we don't really know which one we want to take. But what happens is that fortunately, due to cognitive dissonance, once we make a decision, once we decide which of these 2 things we'd rather pursue, psychological mechanisms start kicking in and they start justifying that decision that we made. Because let's say that I decide to take job A over job B. I decide after weeks of deliberating, I decide to take this first job. And then when I get to that job, I realize, you know what? I really hate this job. I made the bad decision. I should have taken the other job. Well, man, that's going to cause massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. Because again, I think of myself as a competent decision maker, and yet I chose the wrong job. My behavior conflicts with my attitude about myself. That's going to create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance, right? So in other words, to avoid experiencing that cognitive dissonance in the first place, what I do is that as soon as I make a decision of one option, I start justifying it. I start thinking of only the positive qualities of that decision and the negative qualities of the other decision. I don't think about the negative qualities of my current decision and the positive qualities of the alternative decision, because that would cause cognitive dissonance, right? So as a consequence, what happens is that once people make this decision between two roughly equally appealing options, we start convincing ourselves that we made the best decision. I mean, I've experienced this myself, and you probably have as well. So when I first was deciding where to go to graduate school, I had two options that I was looking at. I was looking at the University of Arizona and Iowa State University. And they were different options, but they were both kind of equally appealing, and I struggled with that decision for weeks. Finally, I decided to pick Iowa State University for various reasons. That's where I did my graduate school. And looking back at that decision now, it's hard for me to think that I could have ever considered the University of Arizona. Like sitting here right now, obviously it seems like Iowa State was always the best decision for me. And I know that the reason that I think that is partly because what I did is I'm justifying my past decisions. Right? That happened automatically as a way to avoid experiencing cognitive dissonance. This process, for reasons that we're going to see on the next slide, is sometimes called spreading of alternatives. You're going to see why that's the case. Okay. Let me first describe to you, though, a study that demonstrated this process. So what these researchers did is they went to a shopping mall and they had a table and they laid out a number of household appliances. So I don't know if these are the exact ones they use, but let's just say that these are the ones they use, right? So you have an iron and a food processor and a popcorn machine and a toaster, et cetera, right? And so what they would do is they would stop people who are shopping at the mall and they would ask them, they'd say, okay, we're doing some market research. What we'd like you to do is to rank order these 8 items in terms of their desirability, from most desirable to least desirable. And so obviously people would have all sorts of different ratings for this, right? But whichever that participant rated as 4th and 5th most appealing items, the researcher would then say, well, as a thank you for participating in this study, we actually have 2 of these items here, and we'll let you take one home as a gift. And so whichever items that participant rated as the 4th and 5th most desirable, those are the 2 items the researcher claimed that they had. So let's just say that those 2 items, let's say that it was the blender and the toaster for a given participant. Okay, so they'd say, okay, which would you rather, the blender or the toaster? And they're roughly equally appealing to the participant. They were ranked very closely, right? But they eventually pick one. Let's say they pick the blender. Then what the researchers do is they have participants re-rank order those 8 items. And this is what I'm going to show you on this slide here. So what we're going to look at is, based on that new re-ranking, they calculated basically the rated attractiveness of the product. So they could see basically how much participants liked each of these items. Okay? And specifically what we're looking at here are, of the 2 items they chose between, so let's say the blender and the toaster, the item that they chose and the item that they did not choose. Now, before participants were told that they were able to choose one of these 2 items, as I mentioned, they were both rated about equally attractive, right? Their 4th ranked and their 5th ranked items were roughly equally rated in terms of attractiveness. But once they made a choice, once they decided which of those 2 items they wanted to take home as their free gift, and then they rated how attractive those items were again, whichever item they chose became much more attractive. And whichever item they didn't choose became much less attractive. You see how their ratings of these 2 items, they're spreading apart, right? This is why this is sometimes called the spreading of alternatives, because the ratings of those 2 items spread apart once people make the decision. Okay, what's happened here is that if they've chosen the blender, let's say, instead of the toaster, then once they've chosen that, they start thinking of all the reasons why they really like a blender, right? Like, oh, I need a blender. I'm going to make smoothies every day. And so this is going to be a really good, they start thinking of all the positive aspects of their choice. And they start thinking of all the negative aspects of the choice they didn't make, of the toaster. Well, it turns out, I have an old toaster. I could just use my old toaster. I don't need it anyway. They start focusing on all the negatives. As a consequence, the blender becomes more attractive because they're focused on the positives, and the toaster becomes less attractive because they're focused on the negatives of that item. They didn't have to do that. They could have focused on the negatives of the blender, Maybe they already had a blender, so they didn't need another one. And they could have focused on the positives of the toaster. Maybe they like to eat toast every morning, but they didn't do that, right? Because if they did that, that would create dissonance. That would lead them potentially to experience buyer's remorse, and we don't want to experience that. So as soon as people make a choice, we start justifying the thing that we chose. I know that I've done this many, many times throughout my life. And I imagine that pretty much everyone in this class has at some point as well. Is this related to group polarization? No. So group polarization is something we're going to talk about after exam 2. That's a little different. Group polarization occurs when we're discussing something within a group of people. Okay. What we're talking about here in terms of cognitive dissonance is something that happens within one specific person. Okay, so we'll talk about group polarization later on in the class. We see this in other areas as well. There's some data, for instance, showing that people who are in committed romantic relationships with each other see other people as less attractive than if they weren't in committed relationships, which again makes sense if we think about this from a cognitive dissonance perspective. Right? Once we choose to be with this one person in a monogamous relationship, we're choosing them over everybody else. And we feel a need to justify that choice. So what do? We think about all the positives of the person we're with and all the negatives of the people that we didn't choose to be with. Right? Okay, so a couple words before I finish talking about cognitive dissonance. I've kind of been framing this in terms of saying that whenever we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes, we experience cognitive dissonance. And that's not entirely true. There are certain things that have to be present in order for us to experience cognitive dissonance. It turns out that the human brain, we can handle a little bit of discrepancy between our behaviors and our attitudes without experiencing cognitive dissonance. So these 4 things have to be present in order for us to experience cognitive dissonance. Let's go through them one at a time. First off, there has to be some sort of negative consequence to our behavior. So let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about the original study that we talked about last class. Let's look at this. Okay, so what this original study showed, or what they did is, if you recall, is that people engaged in a really boring task for an hour, and they were then asked if they would be willing to lie to someone else, to tell someone else that the study was in fact a lot of fun. And the people that did that and were only paid $1 to do so, they came to justify to themselves that in fact the study was fun. They convinced themselves the study was actually fun. And the idea here is that these people have this idea, like, I'm someone who tells the truth. And then they lie to another participant and tell them how much fun the study is. So that behavior conflicts with their attitudes, right? As a consequence, they experience cognitive dissonance. To get rid of that cognitive dissonance, what they did is they convinced themselves that in fact the study was actually a lot of fun. And if they could believe the study was fun, then in fact they didn't lie to this participant, right? So what happened here is that their behavior, the fact that they lied to someone else, had negative consequences. It led them to think that, oh, that means that maybe I'm a liar or maybe I'm a hypocrite. It has negative concepts for my conception of who I am as a person. And because of those negative consequences, that's what creates that cognitive dissonance that people felt motivated to reduce. If, on the other hand, let's say that, and I kind of used this example last class as well, but let's say that your friend buys a pair of jeans and they ask you, do I look good in these jeans? And you don't really like them, but you say that, yes, you look great in them, right? Well, you're also lying in that case as well, right? But because you're doing it to spare their feelings, there aren't really the negative consequences associated with that behavior. And because there aren't negative consequences, because you're willing to lie to someone to save their feelings, it doesn't make you feel like you're a bad person or a liar because you told a little white lie, right? So there weren't these negative consequences to that behavior. And because there are no negative consequences, we don't experience cognitive dissonance. So the behavior we engage in that conflicts with our attitude has to lead to some sort of negative consequence for us to experience cognitive dissonance. Secondly, in order to experience cognitive dissonance, there has to be a feeling of personal responsibility that the participant has. And what that means is that I have to feel that I freely chose to engage in the behavior that conflicted with my attitudes. So for instance, in the original study, that we just talked about, when people were told or asked to lie to another person, they weren't told by the experimenter to lie to them. They weren't instructed to do that. They told the experimenter told the participant, okay, it's your choice what you want to do. What I would like you to do is go and tell the next person how much fun this study is, but it's your choice ultimately. And the reason for that is because if you force someone to engage in a behavior that conflicts with their attitudes, then they don't feel bad about it because they were forced to do it, right? So they don't experience cognitive dissonance. So in all of the cognitive dissonance studies that we've talked about, the participants have to feel as if they freely chose to engage in that behavior. And that in choosing to engage in that behavior, they could foresee the negative consequences. If they don't feel personally responsible for that behavior, they don't feel that cognitive dissonance, and you don't see these cognitive dissonance effects. Thirdly, in order for cognitive dissonance to occur, there has to be a feeling, there has to be some physiological arousal within the person. And that's because that physiological arousal, that is the cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that negative feeling of arousal that we get when we behave in a way that conflicts with our attitudes. Now, this is going to be really important for the next 15 minutes or so, because as I'm going to show you in the next few slides, shortly after cognitive dissonance theory came out in the field, an alternative theory came out. And that alternative theory said that it could explain all of the effects that we've talked about in this class, but it could do so without postulating any sort of physiological arousal. So we're going to take a look to see what that is. For now, what we need to know is that cognitive dissonance is a negative aversive arousal state. And so what that means is that theoretically, you should be able to measure that arousal level. People should feel that uncomfortableness, and we should be able to measure that to some degree. If people don't experience physiological arousal, then by definition, they can't be experiencing cognitive dissonance. And finally, the fourth necessary component to experience cognitive dissonance effects is that we have to not only experience that arousal, but we have to believe that that negative arousal is a result of our choice to engage in that behavior that had those negative consequences. We have to attribute that arousal to our own behavior, in other words. So for instance, in the original cognitive dissonance study, presumably the participants who lied to the other participant and told them how much fun the study was, they started to feel kind of negatively about themselves, right? Like, oh, I shouldn't be lying to this person, but I really am, and I feel kind of bad about it. And they had to attribute that feeling of badness, that bad feeling they attributed that to the fact that they just lied to the person. You don't need to know the details of this, but there are some pretty clever studies where what they've done is, in some of the studies, before they do the study, they give people a pill, and they tell people that that pill is going to produce this negative, uncomfortable feeling. And then they run them through a regular cognitive dissonance study, like the one I just described. And in those studies, people don't experience cognitive dissonance. And the reason is because maybe they lie to someone and they tell them how much fun the study is, and they know they're lying and they feel uncomfortable, but they think that it's the pill that's causing them to feel uncomfortable. And if it's the pill that's causing them to feel uncomfortable and not their behavior, then they don't feel bad about having lied to that person. So the basic idea here is simply that when people feel bad about having behaved in a way that conflicted with their attitudes, you'll only experience cognitive dissonance effects if they attribute that feeling, that negative feeling, to their own behavior. Okay, so all four of these things have to be present in order for cognitive dissonance effects to occur. Okay. And just to respond to the chat, do they have to be present simultaneously? Well, they occur at different points, right? Like you have to feel personally responsible, meaning you have to be able to foresee ahead of time what the negative consequences are. And then once you engage in that behavior, you then have to experience arousal and to attribute that arousal to your own behavior. So they all have to be present at some point in the process. Okay, so cognitive dissonance theory was huge in social psychology in the 1960s. Okay, there were hundreds of studies being done, in part because there were so many predictions that cognitive dissonance theory made that there were just a ton of tests that people could do to test the theory. So it became the most popular theory in all of social psychology in the 60s. But in 1972, a researcher by the name of Daryl Bem came around. And he made a claim that he could explain every single one of those past studies. He could explain every single cognitive dissonance study using a different theory, using what he calls self-perception theory. In fact, I introduced self-perception theory to you briefly in a prior class. So remember, self-perception theory is the idea that we can learn about ourselves by observing our own past behavior or thinking about our past behavior and inferring what our attitude must be. Okay. So I'm going to describe to you his claim about how that theory can explain all of the past studies. But the important idea here is that when he came around in the 70s and he said he could explain every single study that's been done, but his theory was better, he said. And his theory was better because it was simpler. So if you remember from like the second week of class, first or second week of class, we talked about what makes a good scientific theory. And one of the criteria for what makes a good scientific theory is that a good theory is simple. By simple, I mean it makes very few assumptions. And Daryl Bem's claim is that at that time, in 1972, no one had ever actually measured if people felt physiologically aroused, if they actually experienced that feeling of cognitive dissonance. We could measure people's attitudes and how their attitudes changed, but no one had ever actually measured that actual feeling of physiological arousal. And so when he came around, he said, look, I don't think we need cognitive dissonance theory. I can explain all these past effects with self-perception theory, and my theory doesn't assume that people have to experience that negative arousal because, therefore, we don't assume that. It's a simpler theory, and because it's a simpler theory, it's a better theory. That's his claim. So let's take a look at this. Okay. So as I mentioned, it's an alternative to cognitive dissonance theory. Now, his claim is that what happens is that people don't justify behavior. And sorry, am I freezing up right now? Because I am on my screen. Am I freezing up for you guys? I am? Okay, I apologize. Hold on one second. I'm gonna see if I can fix this. Okay, I may not be able to fix this. Hold on. Yeah, I'm not sure why this is happening. I wonder if my computer started running some program in the background or something. I apologize. Hopefully this won't be too distracting. You guys can still hear me though, I hope. Okay, good. You might have to just deal with it because I'm not quite sure what's happening here. But as long as you can hear me at least, then that's the most important part. Okay, let me go back. Okay, if things cut out completely, let me know in the chat. But everything's really, really laggy all of a sudden on my computer for reasons that are unknown to me. Okay. Okay, there we go. So the idea here is that instead of justifying our past behavior, that's what people like Leon Festinger, people who believed in cognitive dissonance theory said, right? That we justify our behavior by convincing ourselves that we really liked a study that was boring, or that we really liked a conversation, a group discussion that was boring, or something along those lines. And Bem says that there is no justification process at all. He says that everything is an inference process. Now, what happens is that when you ask people to report what their attitudes are, that what they do is they think about how they behaved recently, and they come to a rational conclusion. They come to an inference about what their attitude must be based on their past behavior. But they're not distorting information or justifying anything. And to explain some more detail, I want to walk you through a couple studies from a self-perception perspective. Okay, and I'm just seeing that there's some people who are telling me their problems are getting a little bit worse here. Hold on. Okay, all right, things look a little bit better to me. I'm hoping they stay this way. Yeah, it looks like for some reason my laptop's plugged in, but the battery was not charging for some reason. But I think I've fixed it now. So I think that was probably the issue. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so let me walk you through a couple studies, okay? Some of the studies that we've already talked about, and I've already explained them in terms of cognitive dissonance theory. I'm going to explain them from a self-perception perspective. But note that the key element here is that there's no negative arousal in a self-perception perspective, okay? And because there's no arousal, there's no need to justify your past behavior in order to reduce that arousal. So in explaining self-perception theory effects, I'm never going to use the word justify or anything like that. But I am going to use words like infer or conclude. You're going to see that it's a very rational explanation for these past effects. So let's take a look at the original study. I just described the original study again a minute ago. So people were lied to someone else to tell them how much fun the study was. And those people who did that and were only paid $1 to do so came to justify that behavior by convincing themselves they liked the study. That's the cognitive dissonance theory explanation. Okay, but here's the self-perception theory explanation. Here's what Daryl Bem would say people did. The participants in this study, after they lied to a participant, after they lied to someone else, and then they were then asked, how much did you like this study? Then what these participants did is they thought, well, let's think about what I just did. If these were participants who were paid $20 to tell a lie, remember, the people who were paid $20 to tell a lie, they didn't come to distort how much they liked the study. They correctly said that they really did not like the study at all. That's what we saw last class. But according to Bem, what these people did is they said, well, let's see, did I like the study? Well, I just told someone how much fun the study was, but I was paid $20 to do so. So I probably only said that for the money. And because I only said that for the money, that probably means that I didn't actually like the study. On the other hand, among participants who told that lie, who told another person how much fun the study was, and were only paid $1 to do so, Daryl Bem says that those people did the following, that when they were asked, what is your attitude towards that study? They thought this, well, a minute ago, I told someone else how much fun the study was. And I was only paid $1 to do that. And so I obviously wouldn't have done that for the money. And so the only reason that I would have told someone how much fun the study was is if I actually thought the study was fun. So I guess that means I really did actually like the study. Okay. Note that in this explanation, these participants are not trying to justify their behavior. They're simply coming to a rational, logical conclusion. They're inferring what their attitude must be given how they just behaved. And if that's true, then the same pattern of data that we saw for the study, that same pattern of data would be just as explained by self-perception as it is by cognitive dissonance theory. And we can do the same thing for any of the other studies that we talked about last class, that when I originally talked about them, I talked about them in relation to cognitive dissonance theory. Okay, so if you recall, this was a study where people gave a talk about the importance of using condoms, and they did so either in public, where they thought it was going to be shown to other kids, or they did it in private. And the people who gave that speech in public came to use or to take more condoms and to use more condoms in their own sex lives than people who did not give that speech in public. And when I originally talked about the study, I mentioned that from a cognitive dissonance perspective, that's because the people who gave a speech in public committed themselves to a position that I am very pro-condom. And so to avoid any cognitive dissonance, they decided, well, I better use condoms myself to avoid cognitive dissonance, right? From a self-perception perspective, what Daryl Bem says is that is this, that when people were deciding, well, let's see, should I take condoms from the study or should I use condoms in my own life? Well, let's see. I just gave a speech about how we should always use condoms, and I gave it in public. So if I gave it in public, I must really mean it. I must really have an attitude to be that I'm very pro-condom. So I guess I should use condoms. So again, note that they're not justifying anything. They're not experiencing any negative arousal. They're simply forming a rational conclusion about what their attitude must be based on their past behavior. So self-perception, basically the same thing as introspecting. It's actually a good question. So not exactly, although I sort of know what you're saying. It's similar to introspecting in that we're thinking about our past behavior, but it's not introspecting. We're not going sort of deep inside ourselves and just pulling out what our attitude is. We're coming to a conclusion about our attitude based on our behavior, right? So you're not going inside yourself to pull out your attitude. You're thinking, well, I behaved in this way, therefore my attitude must be something else. So it's a little bit different from introspection. I also gave you an example. This is the Benjamin Franklin effect, where Benjamin Franklin had an enemy in the legislature, and so he asked to borrow a book from his enemy. And then when he returned the book, suddenly they were friends, right? And the idea was that from the perspective of Benjamin Franklin's enemy, the cognitive dissonance explanation was that, well, I loaned Benjamin Franklin a book, and I wouldn't loan books to strangers. I wouldn't loan books to enemies of mine. So that creates this cognitive dissonance. To avoid that cognitive dissonance, he comes to convince himself that, in fact, actually, I really like Benjamin Franklin. That way, my behavior of loaning him a book is consistent with my attitude of liking Benjamin Franklin. So I'd originally explained that study in terms of cognitive dissonance, right? In terms of justifying his past behavior by convincing himself he really liked Benjamin Franklin. From a self-perception perspective, there's a bit of a different explanation. The self-perception theorist would say, well, when this guy, Benjamin Franklin's enemy, when he was trying to figure out what is my attitude towards Benjamin Franklin? Well, I mean, yesterday I loaned him a book, and I wouldn't loan a book to my enemy, so I guess that means I must like Benjamin Franklin. So I guess I like him, right? So again, we see that in this explanation, he's not justifying his past behavior. He's simply looking at his past behavior and coming to a rational conclusion about what his attitude must be. I also gave an example of cheating. These were kids who were put in a position where they were able to cheat, and some kids did and some kids didn't. And those kids who cheated, when we later asked them, what is your attitude towards cheating? They had a much more lenient attitude towards cheating. It's no big deal at all. And the kids who didn't cheat got a much stricter attitude towards cheating. It's like the worst thing you could do, right? And we explain that in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, that these kids, if they cheated on a test and they were to later say, I'm really against cheating, well, that would produce a lot of dissonance. To avoid that dissonance, they justified their cheating behavior by saying, oh, it's really not a big deal to cheat at all, right? That's the cognitive dissonance explanation. A self-perception theorist would say that really what happened is this, that when you later ask the kids, what is your attitude towards cheating? The kids thought, well, 5 minutes ago, I cheated. And if I cheated, I must have a positive attitude towards it. So I guess my attitude is positive. So again, no justification in this case, no aversive arousal that people are trying to get rid of. People are simply coming to a rational conclusion about their past behavior. Okay? And it turns out that for almost any cognitive dissonance theory study, any study that supported cognitive dissonance theory, self-perception theory could also explain the same study. Now, the key difference, though, hinges on this notion of arousal. Whereas in cognitive dissonance theory, people experience this aversive arousal that they're trying to get rid of, and in self-perception theory, they're not. So later studies were able to test to look to see if people actually experienced this negative arousal. If they did, then presumably cognitive dissonance theory is correct. And if they didn't, then presumably self-perception theory is correct. So which theory is correct? What happened? When they did these studies, what did they actually show? Well, what it looks like is that in fact, both theories are correct in slightly different circumstances. what studies seem to show is this, that when the discrepancy between the behavior and the attitude is large, so you have one attitude and you behave in the exact opposite way, that produces a lot of aversive negative arousal. That produces a lot of cognitive dissonance that people are then motivated to reduce. So if I say cheating is wrong and then I cheat, well, my behavior is the exact opposite of my attitude, right? That's going to produce cognitive dissonance. That's going to make us feel uncomfortable. We're going to want to justify our past behavior. On the other hand, when the discrepancy is small, when you engage in a behavior that's just a little bit different from your attitude, the discrepancy is not big enough to make us feel bad about our behavior. So what we do in those cases is that we infer what our attitude must be by thinking about our past behavior. That's when self-perception theory comes into play. Okay? So that's the key difference. For a big discrepancy, cognitive dissonance theory explains these effects. For small discrepancies, self-perception theory explains these effects. Okay, so one type of question I could ask on exam 2, for instance, that you're going to get next week, is I might give you a scenario and ask you to explain it from the perspective of cognitive dissonance theory, and then ask you to explain it from the perspective of self-perception theory. Now, what I'm looking for here is when you explain these scenarios and from each of these perspectives, when you use cognitive dissonance theory to explain that, then you should talk about people are justifying their behaviors in order to reduce the cognitive dissonance that was created when their behavior conflicted with their attitude, right? When you use self-perception theory to explain whatever scenario I give you, you never want to use the word justify or rationalize or anything like that. What you do is you'd say, well, people are inferring what their attitudes must be based on observing their past behavior. Okay, so just to sum up this section then. Not only do our attitudes influence our behaviors, that's kind of the common sense way that we think about that relationship between attitudes and behaviors, but it's also the case that our behaviors can influence our attitudes. That's what we've spent the last 2 classes looking at. Now, there's a couple of ways that that can happen, right? In cognitive dissonance theory, they say that attitude change can often happen because it's a way to reduce the negative arousal created when you behave in a way contrary to your attitudes. So we behave in a certain way, and we have to justify that behavior, so we change our attitudes to bring it in line with that behavior, to justify it, to get rid of that negative arousal. Additionally, we can also change our attitudes based on our behavior via a self-perception process, which basically says that when we engage in a behavior, that behavior leads us to form rational inferences about what our attitudes must be. And so our attitudes change, not because we're justifying anything, not because we're reducing arousal, but simply because we're inferring what our attitudes must be based on our past behavior. Okay, we are going to have a top hat quiz, but I've got time for a couple questions if people have questions about either self-perception theory or cognitive dissonance theory. Now's a great time to ask. Okay, well, it doesn't look like anyone has anything now. Okay, so both processes can lead to attitude change. Yes, just via different routes. Is that the cause for battered women syndrome or Stockholm syndrome? That's going to be probably a lot more complex, and that's probably going to take an understanding of more clinical psychology to get into that. So although a lot of these principles can play into things like that, the real explanation for a lot of them is going to be much more complex and take a much more clinical perspective, I think. Okay, the 3 types of cognitive dissonance. Well, okay, they're not exactly types of cognitive dissonance, and it's possible your notes might say types, I'm not sure, but they're really domains. In other words, we tend to see cognitive dissonance in one of these 3 conditions. So either when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes, that's what we talked about last class, then we tend to see dissonance. Or if we're trying to justify our past effort, we tend to see a lot of cognitive dissonance. That's what we talked about at the beginning of this class. Or when we have to justify having made a difficult decision between two equally appealing alternatives, then we experience cognitive dissonance as well. Next week on Tuesday, will we still be having a Zoom? No, so there's no Zoom on Tuesday. I'm going to post a link in Canvas to a YouTube lecture that I will record tomorrow. You can watch that at any time. Just make sure you watch it before the exam because you're responsible for that material on the exam on Thursday. But you can watch it anytime once I post it. Explain the roots again. Yeah, so the roots are, that's just what I have on the slide right now, right? Is that there are two different ways of attitude change. So according to cognitive dissonance theory, once we engage in behavior, we have to justify that behavior. And we can justify it a lot of the time by changing our attitude, right? To bring our attitude in line with that behavior. Right? Whereas self-perception theory says that once we engage in a behavior, we don't justify that behavior at all, but rather what we do is that we infer what our attitude must be based on that behavior. If we acted this way, then our attitude must be consistent with that. So it's not a way to justify things, it's just a rational inference that people are making regarding what their attitudes are. Okay, so if there's no other questions, what I'm going to do, let's go to Top Hat and let's have quiz number 6. Okay, these are all 5 questions on cognitive dissonance or self-perception theory. Question number 1. This is what we talked about today. According to cognitive dissonance theory, why do people like a fraternity more if they underwent severe hazing? So in other words, they suffered through a strict initiation in order to join it. A, because they feel a need to justify their desire to haze the next group of people. B, because they infer that they must like the group if they went through all that suffering. C, because downplaying their suffering makes them appear capable to other people. Or D, because it's a way to justify having gone through all of that suffering. Haze the next group means like in the next year, then the new people would then be able to haze the next people, next round of people. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Yes, so D is correct. So if you undergo severe hazing, you suffer to join a group, then we experience cognitive dissonance, because if we got into that group, we decided we don't like it, then why did we undergo all that suffering? We have to justify having undergone through that suffering, right? And the way that we justify it is by convincing ourselves it was worth it and we really liked the group. So D is correct. You can also note that B would be the self-perception explanation, right? And we didn't talk about this when we talked about self-perception, but the self-perception person would say, well, what's really happening is that once these people join a group, if they underwent severe hazing, then when they're trying to figure out, do I like this group? Well, let's see, I went through all that hazing for a week in order to get into this group, and I suffered so much, and I would only suffer that much if I actually liked the group, so I guess I must really like this group, right? So that's the self-perception explanation. Question 2. This is something we talked about last class. When severe and mild threats were used in an attempt to prevent children from engaging in a prohibited activity. This is the one where the kids were kept from playing with a toy that they really wanted to play with. Okay, which of the following was true? A, only the severe threat was strong enough to deter the children from engaging in the prohibited activity. Both threats deterred the children. By the way, just to make sure, deter means kept them from engaging in it, prevented them. So both threats deterred the children, but those given the mild threat showed greater internalization of the rule. C, both threats deterred the children, but those given the severe threat showed greater internalization of the rule. Or D, neither threat was successful in getting the children to internalize the rule. If you want to, by internalize the rule, what I mean is the kids convinced themselves they didn't want to play with that toy. Got 10 seconds left. Three, two, one. So people said B, both threats deterred the children, but those given the mild threat showed greater internalization. That is correct. So what happened is that the people in the severe threat who are threatened, if you play with a toy, you're in big trouble. They didn't play with the toy and they knew exactly why they weren't playing with it. It's because of the extreme threat. But the kids who got a mild threat didn't play with the toy, but they couldn't say they weren't playing with it because of the threat, because it wasn't really a strong threat. So to justify why they weren't playing with the toy, they convinced themselves they didn't really want to play with it anyway. So that's why they showed that greater internalization of the rule. Question 3. Leslie has a belief that she's a very hardworking student, but the night before a big exam, instead of studying, she plays video games for 3 hours. This causes her cognitive dissonance. If she were to reduce her dissonance by adding a consonant cognition, and that's the key, okay? Adding a consonant cognition, which of the following might she do? A, convince herself that she already knows the material and therefore doesn't need to study. B, convince herself that the exam isn't that important anyway. C, convince herself that she had to play video games because her younger brother needed someone to play with. Or D, convince herself that playing video games allows her to relax so that she can concentrate better later. You've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Now, it turns out that all of these strategies could work to reduce her cognitive dissonance, but only one of them works in the sense that it's adding a consonant cognition. Let's see what people said here. So people said is either A or D. D is the correct answer here. So the idea is that adding a consonant cognition means adding a belief that's consistent with both the behavior and the original attitude. And so if she feels like she is a hardworking student and she wants to do well on the exam, but she plays video games, well, obviously that's not consistent with being a hardworking student studying, right? But if she can convince herself that actually playing a video game allows me to concentrate better so I can study better later on, then suddenly playing video games is consistent with her belief that she's a hardworking student, right? So it's a new belief that she's adding that's consistent with her attitude, consistent with her behavior. Convince herself that she already knows the material and doesn't need to study is an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. In other words, I'm a hardworking student, I'm not studying, but it doesn't really matter because I already know the material. Okay. C is also, B is also an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. Again, it's sort of saying, well, I'm a good hardworking student, I'm not studying, but it doesn't really matter because the exam isn't that important anyway. So it's another example of that. C would be an example of reducing perceived choice. So that's a way to, when you reduce your dissonance by saying, well, I had no other option. I had to engage in this behavior. It wasn't my choice. My brother needed someone I had to play for his sake. That's why I'm playing the game. But D is the only one in which you're adding a consonant cognition. Question 4, I think it is. One of the main differences between cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory is that in self-perception theory, A, there's no motivation. B, there's no attitude change. C, people change their attitudes only if other people are present. Or D, attitude change is only temporary. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, this one's a little bit trickier. And the reason is, I think, because a lot of you might be thinking, well, wait a second. You said the big difference is that in self-perception theory, there's no arousal, right? And that's not one of the options. But you have to think about it one step further. If there's no negative arousal, then what that means is there's no motivation to reduce that negative arousal. So what that means is that response A is correct. And yeah, that's why people are responding almost randomly, it looks like here. I know that one's a little bit trickier than some of the other ones, right? But when I say there's no motivation, what I mean is that in self-perception theory, people aren't motivated to come to a specific answer. They're just forming a rational conclusion, right? If I behave this way, I guess this is what my attitude is. In cognitive dissonance theory, there is a motivation. There's motivation to get rid of that arousal. I'm motivated to convince myself that I really liked, that I really liked this study, for instance, this really boring study. Okay. So that's why that one's a little bit trickier than some of the other ones. Self-perception theory, question 5. Self-perception theory explains attitude change when what? A, people know what their true attitudes are. B, the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is small. C, when the behavior produces negative consequences. Or D, when people feel personally responsible for their attitude change. Got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, we just talked about this one. We talked about when cognitive dissonance theory is correct and when self-perception theory is correct. And self-perception theory explains attitude change when B, the discrepancy between behavior and attitude, is small. If the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is large, that's when cognitive dissonance theory explains attitude change. Okay? Remember that when the behavior produces negative consequences or when people feel personally responsible, those are two conditions that are necessary for cognitive dissonance theory to occur, right? But not for self-perception theory. Okay. All right, so just remember that at some point between tomorrow and next Thursday at the exam, make sure that you watch the last lecture on conformity. I think it's probably only going to be about 30 or 40 minutes. I don't think it'll be as long as a normal class. Just make sure to watch that at some point. No class on Tuesday. Thursday is going to be the exam. Okay. All right, guys. Well, I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.